On the morning of January 8, 1815, a British general named Edward Pakenham rode toward a flat stretch of muddy Louisiana sugarcane fields just south of New Orleans. Behind him marched over 8,000 of the most combat-hardened soldiers on Earth, veterans of the Napoleonic Wars, men who had fought Wellington's campaigns across Portugal and Spain, men who had stormed fortified positions in the teeth of French artillery and come out the other side still standing. These were not colonial garrison troops or green recruits. These were the best soldiers Britain had produced in a generation, and they had been sent to America with one clear objective: seize New Orleans, control the Mississippi River, and strangle the young United States from the inside out.
Defending the city was a collection of fighters that no military planner in London would have taken seriously on paper. Regular army soldiers, yes, but not enough of them. Kentucky and Tennessee militia with long rifles and a reputation for being difficult to command. Free black Louisiana volunteers, whose discipline and determination would shock everyone watching. Choctaw warriors fighting on American soil for reasons that were entirely their own. French Creole gentlemen who had dressed in their finest uniforms for the occasion. And at the center of all of it, commanding this improbable alliance, a Tennessee lawyer and land speculator turned general named Andrew Jackson, a man who had never lost a battle and who intended very strongly to keep that record intact. What happened in the next 2 hours was so lopsided, so brutally one-sided, and so far outside anything the British commanders had anticipated that historians have spent 2 centuries arguing about how it was even possible. The British lost over 2,000 men, killed, wounded, or captured. The Americans lost 71. Let that ratio settle for a moment. In under 2 hours, on a flat open field in Louisiana, one of the most powerful military forces on Earth walked into a slaughter so complete that the numbers still seem like a misprint. So what actually happened? And why do the history books leave out the part that makes it genuinely hard to look at?
The war nobody wanted was about to end badly for someone. The War of 1812 had been grinding along for nearly 3 years by the time the British expedition to New Orleans was organized, and almost nobody involved was happy about it. The Americans had launched the war with grand ambitions about annexing Canada and had instead spent 2 years watching their offensives fail, their capital burn, and their coastline strangled by British naval blockade. The British, simultaneously fighting Napoleon across Europe, had treated the American conflict as a secondary annoyance until Napoleon abdicated in 1814, and suddenly tens of thousands of veteran British soldiers were available for redeployment. The New Orleans expedition was the result. 45 ships, over 8,000 troops, a commander of genuine distinction in General Pakenham, brother-in-law to the Duke of Wellington himself. The strategic logic was sound and simple. Control New Orleans, and you control the Mississippi. Control the Mississippi, and you control the commerce of an entire continent. Britain could dictate terms to Washington from a position of overwhelming geographic leverage, and the young American Republic, barely 30 years old, deeply in debt, with a capital city still showing scorch marks from the burning, would have very little choice but to accept them. What the British planners had not fully accounted for was Andrew Jackson.
Andrew Jackson was not a normal general. Jackson had grown up in the Carolina backcountry during the Revolution, and the war had not been a distant, abstract thing for his family. The British had come through personally. A British officer had struck 13-year-old Andrew Jackson with a sword for refusing to clean the officer's boots, a refusal made on the grounds that he was a prisoner of war, not a servant. Jackson carried the scar on his hand for the rest of his life, and a considerably larger scar somewhere deeper than that. His mother died of cholera, contracted while nursing American prisoners held on British ships. His brothers died in the war. By the time the Revolution ended, Andrew Jackson was an orphan, and the entity most directly responsible for that fact was the British Army. He was not a man who needed ideological motivation to fight the British. He had personal reasons that went down to the bone. By 1814, Jackson had translated that fury into a military career of extraordinary effectiveness. He had crushed the Creek Nation at the Battle of Horseshoe Bend earlier that year in one of the most complete military victories in American frontier history. He had shown repeatedly a quality that defined everything he did as a commander. He attacked. He was not cautious. He was not inclined to wait and see. And when he arrived in New Orleans in December of 1814 and surveyed the situation, the city undermanned, barely fortified, wide open from multiple approaches, he did not despair. He got to work. Jackson built his kill zone. The ground south of New Orleans gave Jackson something to work with if he was smart about it. A narrow strip of land ran between the Mississippi River on one side and a cypress swamp on the other. At its narrowest, this corridor was roughly half a mile wide, half a mile through which any British force advancing on the city from the south would have to pass. There was no way around it. The river blocked one flank completely. The swamp, thick and deep and disorienting, blocked the other. Any attacker had to come straight through. Jackson ordered the construction of an earthen rampart across this corridor, running the entire half-mile width from river to swamp. His men dug with everything they had: shovels, boards, their bare hands when necessary. They piled earth, they reinforced the walls with cotton bales and timber, and they constructed firing platforms that gave the defenders a clean, elevated line of sight across the flat open field in front of the position. On that field, the British would have to advance over roughly half a mile of completely exposed, featureless, muddy ground with no cover of any kind. Then Jackson lined that rampart with guns, artillery pieces positioned to sweep the entire width of the field, rifle companies placed at intervals along the entire length of the wall, the Barataria pirates, smugglers and privateers under the leadership of Jean Lafitte, men whom Jackson had initially tried to arrest before pragmatism overcame principle, manned the artillery with a skill that surprised observers who had expected criminals to be poor gunners. They were, in fact, excellent gunners. Lafitte's men had spent years firing cannons at ships, which is considerably harder than firing at a stationary line of infantry advancing across flat ground. Jackson placed his command post where he could see everything, issued his orders with the blunt directness that was his trademark, and waited. Pakenham's plan had one fatal assumption. General Pakenham's battle plan for the morning of January 8th was not, in theory, a bad one. He understood the geography. He knew his men had to cross open ground under fire before they could reach Jackson's line. He planned for it. His scheme involved a coordinated assault from multiple directions simultaneously, a column attacking along the riverbank, another force crossing the river to neutralize American guns on the opposite bank, and the main assault column advancing directly across the open field toward the center of Jackson's earthworks. The plan assumed several things would go right. It assumed the column crossing the river would succeed and neutralize the American artillery that could enfilade his main attack. It assumed his troops could cross the open ground quickly enough that the period of maximum exposure would be brief. It assumed the earthworks, when they reached them, could be stormed with the ladders and fascines his men were carrying, tools for scaling and crossing fortifications that were standard equipment for an army accustomed to attacking prepared positions. Most critically, it assumed American militia would behave the way American militia had behaved so many times before, reasonably well at a distance, but susceptible to breaking when British regulars close to bayonet range and the psychological pressure of a mass charge hit them in the chest. This last assumption was the one that killed him, literally. The morning of January 8th, fog, mud, and a signal rocket. The British assault was supposed to begin in coordinated fashion, with multiple elements moving simultaneously. It did not begin that way. The rocket signal that launched the attack went up before the flanking column crossing the river was anywhere near ready. The men who were supposed to carry ladders and fascines to the front of the assault columns, the tools that would allow the infantry to cross Jackson's ditch and scale the earthworks, had fallen behind in the darkness and the mud. Some of the ladders never made it to the front at all.
The coordination that Pakenham's plan depended on had already begun to unravel before a single shot was fired. But the rocket had gone up, and British officers had trained their men to advance when the signal came. So they advanced. Out of the morning fog, in columns and lines that must have looked genuinely impressive in their precision and their scarlet uniforms, the British infantry stepped onto the open field and began their march toward Jackson's earthworks half a mile away.
Inside those earthworks, Andrew Jackson watched them come. He reportedly said very little. He had already said what needed to be said. His men knew their positions, knew their weapons, knew their fields of fire. The Tennessee and Kentucky riflemen behind the rampart had loaded their long rifles with the careful attention of men who understood that every shot mattered, and that the man who shot without aiming was not merely wasting ammunition, he was wasting the only advantage that stood between the city behind him and the army in front of him. The artillery crews at their guns, Lafitte's pirates and regular army cannoneers alike had their pieces loaded and pointed at the field. Jackson gave the order to hold fire until the British were within effective range. He was not going to waste the first volley on men at the limit of accuracy. He was going to wait until missing was difficult.
The first volleys, what the history books don't fully convey. Here is the part that the sanitized versions tend to move past quickly, because what happened in the next 30 minutes on that field was not a battle in any conventional sense. It was a systematic mechanical destruction of human beings, walking in organized formation across open ground toward fixed defensive positions manned by accurate shooters. When Jackson's guns opened up, the effect was immediate and catastrophic. Artillery firing canister shot, essentially enormous shotgun blasts, canisters packed with iron balls that spread in a wide pattern at close range, tore through the British columns at a rate that no advancing infantry could sustain. A single canister round from a well-served artillery piece, fired into a column of soldiers advancing in close formation, could kill or wound a dozen men in an instant. Jackson had multiple artillery pieces. They were well served. They fired continuously.
Behind the artillery, the long riflemen opened up on individual targets with a precision that British officers had not anticipated and could not effectively counter. The long rifle that Kentucky and Tennessee frontiersmen carried was not the standard military musket of the era. It was accurate at ranges where a musket became essentially a noisemaker. Riflemen behind Jackson's earthworks could hit specific targets at ranges where British soldiers had no realistic ability to shoot back effectively. They aimed for officers, they aimed for sergeants, they aimed for anyone whose death would disrupt the organization and forward momentum of the advancing columns. The British came on anyway. This is the part that deserves acknowledgement and respect even in the context of a catastrophic defeat. These men kept walking forward into fire that was killing and wounding their comrades in large numbers with every passing minute. They had been trained to do exactly this. They had advanced into French artillery at Salamanca and Vitoria. They had closed on fortified positions before. They had been told that infantry in good order pressing forward with resolution could carry almost any position. They believed it because in most of their experience, it had been true. It was not true here. When the columns reached the ditch, the British assault columns that actually reached Jackson's earthworks, a fraction of the men who had started across that field, arrived to find that the ladders and fascines they needed to cross the ditch and scale the wall were not there. The men carrying those tools had fallen behind, gone to the wrong place in the fog and confusion, or been cut down before they reached the front. What followed at the base of Jackson's earthworks was among the most brutal close-quarters fighting of the entire war. British soldiers who had crossed half a mile of open ground under continuous fire, watching men drop around them with every step, arrived at the wall with their bayonets and their determination and nowhere to go. They could not get over the wall without ladders. They could not retreat across the same open ground they had just crossed without being shot down on the way back. Some of them pressed against the base of the earthworks, below the angle at which the defenders on top could shoot them, and stayed there because there was nowhere else to go. At the top of the wall, Jackson's men shot down at point-blank range. Riflemen leaned over the parapet and fired into the mass of British soldiers piled against the base of the fortification. Others used the butts of their rifles as clubs when the press got close enough. It was not war in any romantic or distant sense. It was men killing other men at ranges measured in inches, in a confined space, with no room to maneuver and no good options for anyone pressed against that wall. The men who had made it to the earthworks were already a fraction of the force that had started the assault. The field behind them was covered with British dead and wounded, lying in the mud, fallen at intervals all the way back across the half-mile they had crossed. Later accounts described the field as carpeted with red, the color of British uniforms against the brown Louisiana mud, in long, terrible rows that marked the paths the assault columns had taken.
General Pakenham had watched the assault begin to collapse from his command position. He had ridden forward to try to rally his men personally, a gesture of personal courage that reflected the command culture of the British Army in that era, where generals were expected to lead from visible positions and inspire by example. He rode onto that open field on horseback, a figure of authority in scarlet and gold, and the Kentucky riflemen behind Jackson's earthworks saw him. He was hit. He managed to stay in the saddle. He was hit again. He fell from his horse and died on the field, within sight of the earthworks his army had failed to take. Two of his subordinate generals were also hit, one killed, one severely wounded. In the space of the assault's critical minutes, the British Army in Louisiana lost its commanding general and most of its senior leadership to American rifle fire. Without Pakenham, without a unified command, without the ladders and fascines that might have given the assault some chance of success, the attack faltered and then stopped. Units that had maintained their cohesion through the advance across the open ground now had no one to give them a clear order about what to do next. Some continued to press against the earthworks, others began to fall back. The coordination that a functioning command structure might have preserved simply ceased to exist. The assault was over. It had lasted less than 2 hours.
The numbers that don't seem real. The final casualty count for the Battle of New Orleans is one of those historical facts that people read twice because they assume they misread it the first time. The British suffered approximately 2,037 casualties, 291 killed, 1,267 wounded, and 484 captured or missing. Among the dead were their commanding general, 2 additional generals, 8 colonels, and a catastrophic proportion of their experienced officer corps. The force that had arrived in Louisiana as one of the most powerful military expeditions Britain had mounted against North America was broken as an effective fighting instrument in a single morning. American casualties totaled 71, 13 killed and 58 wounded. On the main line of Jackson's earthworks, the position that had been the primary target of the British main assault, the Americans suffered exactly 6 casualties. 6. The lopsidedness of these numbers is not simply a matter of good defensive ground or accurate shooting, though both of those things were real factors. It reflects the complete failure of the assault at every level: failed coordination, failed logistics, failed command, failed assumption about the nature of the defenders behind those earthworks. The British plan required multiple things to go right. Almost none of them did. But the history books leave out. The history of the Battle of New Orleans is usually told as a triumph, a stirring cinematic American victory that lifted national morale and produced a song that stayed in popular culture for generations. And it was a triumph. But the triumphant narrative tends to move past the field itself fairly quickly, because what happened on that field was not triumphant from most angles. It was a killing ground, and the men who died on it died in large numbers in a short time in conditions of extreme violence that left survivors on both sides marked for the rest of their lives. British veterans who survived the assault wrote about it in terms that were unusual for men who had fought across the peninsula against Napoleon's armies and thought of themselves as beyond being shocked by war. The combination of artillery fire and long rifle accuracy at sustained range was something they had not experienced in quite this form before. At Waterloo later that year, Wellington would fight a different kind of battle against different opponents in different terrain, but the men who had crossed that Louisiana field in January knew something particular about what it meant to advance without cover against defenders who could hit you accurately from the moment you came into range.
On the American side, the men behind Jackson's earthworks had defended their positions effectively, and the numbers confirmed it. But they had also watched what happened to the men who tried to reach them, and several accounts from American defenders described the experience not with pure elation, but with something more complicated. The particular psychological weight that comes from watching large numbers of human beings die in front of you in a short period of time, regardless of which side those human beings were on. The battle was over. The British withdrew. Peace negotiations that had actually concluded in Ghent on December 24th, 2 weeks before the battle, before news could cross the Atlantic in that era, would be ratified, and the war would formally end. The Battle of New Orleans had been fought after the peace treaty was signed and changed nothing in diplomatic terms.
Why it still matters. The Battle of New Orleans did not change the outcome of the War of 1812. The Treaty of Ghent had already done that. What it changed was something harder to measure, and in some ways more lasting. It gave the United States a story about itself, a story in which a ragtag collection of frontier militia and pirates and Creole gentlemen and free black soldiers and Native American warriors, commanded by a scarred Tennessee lawyer, had stood in the way of the finest army Britain could send and turned that army into a catastrophe. A story in which the amateur had beaten the professional so completely that the professionals could barely explain what had happened. A story that fit, perfectly, the narrative the young American Republic most needed to tell about itself in those early years. That something new was being built here, that the rules that governed the old world did not necessarily apply to the new one, and that the combination of individual skill, geographic intelligence, and the willingness to fight for something personal could overcome inherited institutional power. Andrew Jackson became a national hero of the First Order. He would eventually become President of the United States, riding the cowpens narrative, the common man beating the elites, the self-made fighter defeating the formally trained aristocrat, all the way to the White House. The battle made him. The British loaded their dead and their wounded onto their ships and sailed away from Louisiana. They left behind a field that, by any honest measure, should not have gone the way it did. They had more men, more training, more experience, more everything, except for the earthworks and the guns behind them, and the men who had decided that on this particular ground, on this particular morning, they were not going to move. The field at Chalmette is quiet now. A national historical park marks the site where Jackson's line stood, where the British columns advanced, where the morning fog lifted to reveal the full extent of what had happened. The Mississippi rolls past on one side. The cypress swamp sits unchanged on the other. The corridor is exactly as narrow as it was in January of 1815, and standing in it, looking out across the flat open ground where 8,000 British soldiers tried to walk to New Orleans, it is not difficult to understand what happened to them. There was nowhere to hide, there was nowhere to go but forward, and forward on that morning was the last direction anyone should have walked.